Welcome back to Journalism 102, and today we'll be focusing on diversity in storytelling. So, diversity is an important component of journalism, and it's something that I will want you to really think about in your assignments for the week ahead and in all the stories that you do for the rest of this class, because diversity makes stories richer and better, and it's just a good habit for all journalists to get into. So let's start by defining what do we mean by diversity. And here's an example of some of the many different types of diversity that you may consider when doing the reporting that you're doing for this class and for other venues as you go forward. So in the center there are some of the most common forms, sort of diversity dimensions that journalists will focus on. Age is certainly a big dimension of diversity for us, as many of you are students. And one of the things that we really have to push you on as journalism professors is to get you to go beyond talking to people your own age. So to go beyond talking to people who are just like you in the sense that they are college students. But this is also an issue in the professional world as well. Oftentimes, the elderly are not represented to the extent that they are part of the audience as a whole. The elderly make up a very big chunk of the audience for news, yet you can watch an entire newscast or go through an entire newspaper and see very few representations of elderly people in the news itself. Ethnicity, race and ethnicity is one of those dimensions that gets a lot of attention. We talk about race as a dimension of diversity in Mississippi and throughout the country on many different occasions. Certainly with the election of our first black president, race became more of a discussion point within journalism, but it's always been an important dimension of diversity for us to address. And sometimes we just have to force ourselves to go beyond people who look just like us to try to incorporate more diverse perspectives into our stories. Gender, another area of diversity. How many sports stories have you read or seen in your life that include no women? Many times we fall into very, sort of customary traps as it relates to stories. How many stories about children do you see fathers interviewed for? Oftentimes it's the mom that's interviewed. So pushing yourself to think beyond the typical will add interest to your story and add a unique element to your story that is likely to make it better and to make it more newsworthy. Sexual orientation, another dimension of diversity. Health, as in ability or disability. This is, again, an underrepresented area of our population. How many disabled people do you see represented as experts in stories? I sure don't see very many. And so this is something that we have to push ourselves to do better at. In the outside circle are additional dimensions of diversity that perhaps get overlooked even more so than the ones in the center. Geographic region can make a big difference in the ways in which people perceive certain issues. Income, I think, should probably be in that center circle because socioeconomic status is probably a bigger predictor of difference among people than nearly any other. We have a lot more in common with people in our same socioeconomic status who have a different race or ethnicity from us than we do with people who are of our same race or ethnicity who have a much different socioeconomic status. So our lives are much more defined by the social and the economic strata that we live in versus our race or ethnicity, our age, our religion, etc. So why is diversity important? Certainly I've been talking a bit about the ways in which they can make stories more unique. And there are, I'd say, three real primary areas of focus where diversity makes a difference in journalism. So the first is more accurate reporting. So we just talked about how the perspectives of people in the South may be very different than the perspectives of people in the Northeast on particular, maybe immigration. So if you only offer perspectives on immigration from people living in Arizona, your story is less accurate if it is designed to reflect how people in the United States feel about immigration than if you also include people from the Midwest and the Northeast and the upper West, as in, Oregon, Washington State. So if we want to give a complete picture of an issue, we need to include as many different perspectives and as diverse a number of perspectives as we can handle, because that's going to make our story more accurate. It's also sort of an economic reality that you will likely grow your audience by including more diverse topics, more diverse people. Our audience is incredibly diverse, and your exercise for this week is going to involve you sort of getting a sense for how diverse our local communities are, as well as how diverse the country is, the state is. And so as our audience becomes more diverse, if they see themselves reflected in our stories, they are more likely to feel like those stories are relevant to them. Remember when we talked about newsworthiness criteria and how important that is? So the more that the story has an impact and can be seen to be directly relevant to the reader or the user or viewer, the more likely it is that that story will be newsworthy to them. And this is a little bit esoteric perhaps, but for many years journalists have felt that part of their job is to give voice to the voiceless, to share the stories of people that are important but that aren't necessarily generally reported on. So for example, oftentimes those points of difference that we just discussed earlier, people from lower socioeconomic status that live in poverty are often undercovered. We don't hear their voices very much. And so journalists who do stories about people living in poverty are giving voice to the voiceless. People with disabilities often aren't heard from. And so journalists who do stories about people with different levels of physical ability are giving voice to the voiceless. So that's part of sort of what journalists believe is their role in society, is to shed light where there isn't any, and to share the stories of people that can't tell their stories themselves. So how do newsrooms do all this? So for anyone considering a job in the profession, how do newsrooms address these issues? Well, one of the ways they do it is they hire diverse staffs. So they, specifically seek out people who can bring diverse perspectives to their newsrooms. Sometimes that might be age related. Sometimes that might be race or ethnicity related. Sometimes that might be physical ability related. So, good newsrooms often try to get as many different types of people on their staffs as they can so that they have a better understanding of the many issues and the many perspectives related to the news that they cover. Newsrooms also cover diverse topics. So they particularly seek out stories that they know are going to touch on areas of diversity. So seeking out stories about interracial marriage, or seeking out stories about new programs to help students with learning disabilities. Those types of stories often can add a dimension into your programming that really create unique content and provide and drive viewer interest or reader interest. And then they also include diverse sources. So one of the things that you'll see, many studies will say things like they'll do surveys of what's happening on the network news, for example. Not too many years ago, there was a survey done of how many times people of Hispanic heritage were represented as experts on the network news. And despite the fact that now the Hispanic population essentially reflects better than, I think it's 16% of the demographics in the US, they were represented as experts. Fewer than 2% of the experts on the network news were Hispanics. So they were being underrepresented in that role, and then overrepresented as people living in poverty or criminals, etc. So including diverse sources as both the experts in our stories and as everyday people reacting to issues. That's another way that journalists and newsrooms try to diversify their coverage. So one of the things that I have used as a tool anytime I've moved to a new location is census data. So in 2010, many of you probably participated in the 2010 census. And the census provides a treasure trove of information for journalists. One really quick way to get a feel for your community, your state, and the country as a whole, and how diverse the population is by checking out the quick facts section of the census. You can just Google census, quick facts, and your county and state, and it'll pop right up as a quick facts document. So you will need to do that in order to complete one of the assignments for this week. The assignment is posted on Blackboard under content, and there are more details under your weekly lessons. And what you're going to do is you're going to answer a series of questions, and here's an example of one. What's the percentage of people 65 and older in the U.S., in Mississippi, and in your county? And then based on the data from all of these questions that you answer, I want you to come up with a story idea and the diverse sources that you might incorporate into that story. So for this one, let's say your county ends up having a much higher percentage of elderly people than the state as a whole or the country as a whole. So a story might be, are there enough services available for the elderly in your community? Are there big gaps in the services for the elderly in your community? And who are the people that you might talk to about this? Certainly, you would probably want to talk to people who are either getting help from these services or people who don't get the services that they need. They're going to be elderly, of course. And you would also then want to think about, what are some other perspectives on this? Maybe part of the perspective is that young people are in need of services too. And you have to make some tough choices, as you know, the funds aren't unlimited. So do children suffer because the elderly need more services? So there are lots of issues and lots of ramifications to any of the stories that you might find. And you want to think about how the different perspectives you might bring into the story might change the focus of that story. So good luck with your assignments. I hope that as you work on story 2, you'll consider how to bring in a diversity component, a diversity dimension into that story.